everyone. My name is Nile Blass. I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm the DMV community organizer for the League of Women Voters, our national office. So I do a lot of work around obviously supporting the District of Columbia, Maryland, Virginia, our state and local leagues there. But another really big part of my work that I've been excited about is our youth engagement and young voter programming. So how are we bringing young people into our political spaces, not just as bodies at rallies, but as leaders, as people who want to innovate and support this like banner of nonpartisan work that we do in ensuring that we have ballot access and engagement and things of that nature. So my Wi-Fi is a little finicky. So I was going to try to put up a little PowerPoint slide that kind of went over some of our community rules and guidelines, but it's no problem. I'll just read them out myself. I feel like it's kind of just helpful for framing the work we're doing. So obviously we have league members here, but we also have some of our wonderful partners communities. So we have Circle, NAACP, the Workers Circle, Rhizome. So in the group chat, if you could say your name, the organization that you're coming from in support of this event, and then pronouns, that would be great. This panel conversation is going to be recorded to share with attendees and others afterwards. If you're not speaking, it would be great if you were able to mute yourself just so we can minimize distractions. And obviously throughout the time that we're discussing, you can use the chat box throughout the training to share your questions and thoughts. We have people watching it so that they can kind of grab those. And aside from maybe some hand raising at the end for the Q&A, we can speak to some of those questions. And then I guess just 4 more little community norms that I think are helpful is 1, we love to bring our full selves and to limit those outside distractions when we're engaging in really productive conversations such as this. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of expertise and experience shared. So what is learned here should leave here because we want to spread that out into our communities. We want to use active and reflective listening. And obviously, you know, no one knows everything, but just from this coalition that we have and the panelists, together we still hold a lot of wisdom and a lot of education, and a lot of nuance, and a lot of experience, and that's always worthy of sharing. So kind of framing that as how we want to show up in this space and engage with each other. July 1st was just the anniversary of the 26th Amendment, which granted young people aged 18 and above the right to vote. And obviously this is a civic milestone, but when we're seeing different legislation moving, attempting to restrict the ability for young people to not just engage with the ballot directly, but education around politics and around those uncomfortable conversations we have to have in politics when it comes to race and gender and other intersections of identity. That's why these types of conversations become so relevant and so important. So in pulling together this panel, we really wanted to make sure that we weren't just speaking to the historical context of why that 26th Amendment mattered or what historically it has mattered for young people to vote, but what is the contemporary landscape of young voters? What is the data saying? What are our experiences out in the field saying? And what does that mean for the work that we continue to do in the future? Not just for the 2024 electoral cycle, even though that's going to be important, but just every electoral cycle afterwards, period, at the national, state, and local level. So kind of going into that, I'm going to introduce our wonderful panelists. So I'm going to be starting off with Jacob Merkle. So Jacob has a background in the organizing and nonprofit world, and he was most recently the director of student engagement for When We All Vote. He co-founded Rhizome with 90 other young people out of the desire to build community, spend time meaningfully, and hold space for emerging leaders to realize their potential. And in 2021, he completed a Master of Philosophy in Sociology from Cambridge, where his dissertation focused on the language used by history's most persuasive nonviolent movements to activate people's identities into civic and social action. So it's wonderful to have you, Jacob, and he's here not just as a mentor and as an organizer, but as the CEO of Rhizome. So going into our next wonderful panelist, we have Alyssa Canty from Common Cause. She is their director of youth programs. She joined the national team as a youth programs manager in July 2019. She joined Common Cause North Carolina in May of 2015, and she was working with students at Fayetteville State, NC Central, St. Augustine's, and Shaw Universities. She earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in Women's Studies and Public Policy from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, a certificate in not-for-profit management from Salem College, and a Master of Public Administration from North Carolina Central University. She has worked with such organizations as Breakthrough Atlanta, Shorter Education Foundation, Lillian's List, the Planned Parenthood of Central North Carolina, and the LGBT Center of Raleigh. So wonderful to have you. Thanks for joining us. Next, we have Noah Barron, who is the social justice organizer at Workers Circle. Noah is the social justice organizer at Worker Circle, and that is a national Jewish social justice organization, and they are passionate about multi-generational organizing. They helped found and now oversee Worker Circle College Network, the first and only national network of hundreds of young people connected for social justice and inspired by Yiddish culture. In 2021 and 2022, they organized dozens of college students for powerful civil disobedience actions for voting rights outside the White House and the U.S. Capitol, alongside the League of Women Voters, and to march in Selma alongside Black Votes Matter. Noah was named one of Jewish Week's 36 under 36 in 2021 in honor of their progressive organizing. And they hold a BA in Hebrew Judaic Studies from New York University. And in their spare time, they love music, cooking, painting, and they live in Harlem. So thank you for joining us, Noah. Then we have Ruby Belle Booth. She is a youth voter researcher at Circle. So Ruby started at Circle as a diverse democracy fellow in the summer of 2020 and is now Circle's election coordinator. She graduated from Tufts University in 2021 with a bachelor's in history and women, gender, and sexuality studies. Ruby is interested in youth civic participation as a pathway for social, racial, and economic justice, and she's passionate about increasing youth voices throughout our political education systems and in Circle's work. At Circle, she has worked on a range of projects, including the Circle Growing Voters Report, and she is coordinating Circle's 2022 election work and moving forward from that. Ruby is a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice, researching civic learning and engagement. So thank you for joining us. And finally, but not least, we have Francesca Mitchell from the NAACP, who is one of their youth board members. Francesca Mitchell is an undergraduate at Elon University in North Carolina, majoring in public health. Born and raised in Florida, she serves as the Region 5's youth board member for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples National Board of Directors, and is a member of the National Youth Work Committee for the NAACP's National Youth and College Division. Coming from a civil rights family, she has dedicated her work to increasing political engagement, social justice, and advocacy building in all Black and Brown communities she serves. So that makes our, not me not knowing how to count, 6 panelists, and it's wonderful to see you all. It's wonderful to get this conversation going. So I don't want this to be overstructured, so I'm going to allow us to popcorn and kind of build off of the questions and answers and let it flow. But I guess I'll kick it off with this first question, which is, how has the participation of young voters evolved since the ratification of the 26th Amendment? And what are some notable trends or changes in youth voter engagement? I think, Ruby, since you work a lot in research, I think that might be a perfect question to start off with you.
Yeah, I'm happy to start off, and thanks so much for having me, and thank you all for being here. Such amazing panelists. I can't believe that I get to speak with you all today. 3 main trends I want to highlight from the data when it comes to the sort of evolution of youth voting since over the last 50 years, really. So first, I want to look at youth voter turnout. We see pretty much a great deal of inconsistency, especially in presidential elections in these 50 years. There's been really high points like 92, 08, and 2020, and really low points like 96 and 2000. And if anything, that really just highlights the continued importance of context in any given election. So who's running locally, statewide, and nationally? What are the top issues? Are young voters being invested in? All these questions really matter in every single one of those elections and all of those elections going forward. We've also seen since the turn of the century a change in youth vote choice, with more young people turning out to support Democratic candidates and fewer supporting Republicans. And as this partisan split of youth continues to grow and has grown, there's along with it a growing danger that one party may take some of these votes for granted, another might consider young people a lost cause or even try to suppress their votes. So understanding this dynamic is really important when thinking about the future of youth voter engagement. And I think the last thing I would highlight, especially, I think it's the most important point when thinking about what we want to see in the next 50 years of youth voter engagement, is that there has been persistent inequality in these last 50 years in turnout when it comes to race, and especially when it comes to education. And our research consistently finds that isn't because of lack of interest, but rather because of inequities in access to opportunities to learn about and become engaged in voting in elections. And so I think that is an essential thing to understand when you're thinking about what things have changed and what things haven't changed in the last 50 years. And when we think about the future of youth voter engagement, we need to be thinking about how we can make sure that a greater diversity of young people have the information they need to participate. But I think that all these organizers can have a sense of what that actually looks like on the ground and what the actual kind of work we need to do to get more people engaged is.
Thank you. And that's a perfect tone setter. But, as you said, I'd love to open the floor to what other people might want to add on to that question. Don't all go first.
I can jump in. I want to add on to that and say that right now we're living in this time of really widespread voter suppression. And this voter suppression, kind of as you alluded to, is very racialized. And young voters, like everyone else, we're not dumb. We can feel and we can tell that our ability to change things through voting rights and through voting has been diminished in recent years. Then this is because of the rise in voter suppression laws and the attacks on the Voting Rights Act and the increase in gerrymandering and all these things that have kind of dragged our country into what Ari Berman, who's a prominent voting rights journalist, what he calls minority rule. But in 2022, we saw a rise in the participation of young voters from the few years before because we knew what was at stake. We didn't want to see our country continue on this path towards fascism. We turned out because we felt like our country was at stake and our rights were at stake. And I also think it's worth noting that Gen Z is the most multiracial generation so far. We really understand the need for a truly multiracial and multicultural democracy. At the Worker Circle, racial justice is really the foundation of our voting rights work. Fighting for voting rights and democracy reforms are how we put real muscle behind our racial justice commitments. And young people, I feel like we really get the urgency of this moment, which has been underscored by last week's Supreme Court decisions regarding affirmative action and student debt and LGBTQ+ discrimination. So I think really what's going on right this second is, as young people, we know that now is the time to demand democracy and fight fascism, and we can do that through voting.
I couldn't agree more, but I also want to uplift what you said when it's saying young people are watching the landscape. And if we're going to be putting our energy into certain political or social or civic advocacy, we have to feel that if I'm going to the ballot, that's going to have a meaningful return. And if we're not making that a clear pathway between that point A of voting to that point B of policy or resource or engagement, then it's hard to convince people that that's the worthy investment. And I think that's obviously the challenge and the mission of all of our organizations and our different ways of working. I guess kind of building into that, a perfect little segue is, what role can grassroots movements and community organizing play in mobilizing and empowering young voters? Are there any successful examples that you can share? And what I'll note is that I believe several of our panelists are in head of or in directing youth fellowships, youth coordination networks that are specifically tasked with that grassroots tapping in. So, Jacob from Rhizome, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question.
Yeah, I think reluctant to follow Noah, but I will try because now you said my name, so now I have to. Alyssa, Francesca, I was hoping she would say your names, but alas. Yeah, so I think one of the really difficult things about youth organizing is that young people's lives are so transient. And often in organizing spaces, we kind of lean on this charismatic leadership model of there being one person who's almost always a man who is looked to as the head person, and everyone else is seen as part of that team. And so one of the questions we've been grappling with within Rhizome, and we're co-founded by 90 young people almost 2 years ago. We're finally in a place where we've moved from survival mode to can we reach our potential mode? One of the big questions we've been grappling with is really grounded in the theory and philosophy and practice of Ella Baker, who said actually, if we want to organize sustainably, if we want to do it meaningfully, if we want to do it in a way that's authentically rooted in community, we need to have group-based models of leadership. And so to your question, Nile, I think so much of our approach is not only do we need to empower student leaders, but we need to empower teams of student leaders so that people can cycle in and out, but there's stability to the system. And I think one of the things I really admire about League of Women's Voters in particular is you all are one of the few organizations that combines a genuinely grassroots approach among members with scale. And one of the big questions we face is how can we learn from that and form those multi-generational partnerships in order to extend young people's time horizons and build youth-led systems that are really stable and deeply grounded in community, even as people's lives are transient. Because I think for most young folks, especially those in high school who we work with, the best way to reach them, it's not necessarily about their identity as a voter. It's not necessarily about the specific issues they care about. It's not necessarily about solidarity. It is about all those things. Pick and choose based on the person. But more than anything, it's about like who's delivering the message and like, do they trust them? And so that's one of the reasons now why I've been so excited about our conversations is like trying to figure out how we can, match the wisdom of older folks with the energy and the verve and the tenacity of younger people. So Noah, that's my attempt to follow you. And it looks like Jessica and Francesca both have hands raised.
Yeah, go for Francesca.
So firstly, as a grassroots organization, the NAACP continues to commit ourselves to the duty and responsibility in informing our local communities, state conferences, as well as our national fronts that we are for increasing civic engagement among all citizens, especially communities of color, as well as building awareness to our targets on the various policy issues occurring at all levels of government. So to the question in mobilizing and empowering youth voters as a part of the NAACP National Youth and College Division, which is made up generally of mostly really 6-year-olds to all the way to 25-year-olds in leading this fight. We play the role in assisting our young leaders with training, resources, as well as strategies that will better equip them in the field. For instance, every election cycle, we usually use that time, any election cycle, whether it's through the state, whether it's through the national, or whether it is looking at local elections. We use that time to develop innovative ideas for our youth to engage in our Get Out to Vote campaign. One of those ideas in the past was to challenge our youth units to register as many voters in their communities as a part of a national competition in which certain units were recognized nationally for. The NAACP also requires units to consistently participate in training to remain informed of the new and emerging voter suppression laws and other voting right initiatives that are happening at the local level, state level, and national level. And so as a result to how we continue to bring in the fight as the NAACP that we are, the boldest and the oldest organization, that we continue to uplift our youth in terms of whether it be financial assistance, trying to uplift them in those times of needs, whether it's through policies that are happening in certain states, such as Florida, where we are having to deal with laws that prevent third-party organizations such as like the NAACP and the Women League of Voters there in terms of registering people to vote. And so those are the things that we're trying to mobilize and encourage you to be strong and to continue moving forward.
And I definitely think something that you kind of touched on this, Jacob, and that connection between the League of Women Voters and Rhizome and how we can have that exchange of information. Like you have like organizations like the NAACP that have those centuries of not just the general voter engagement that we're doing, but voter engagement with the DEI and racial justice lens that is necessary for our current political moment, right? We have a lot of institutions, both partisan and nonpartisan, that have been doing politics for a long time, but have they been doing it in the context of ensuring that everybody's vote matters and that we want everyone at the ballot and that there's not a particular color in which we associate a value of resource and investment, right? And so especially when we're talking about that intergenerational exchange, like the NAACP and a lot of other Black and brown focused and historically based organizations are where that template exists and where we oftentimes should be pulling from, along with, the League of Women Voters and other institutions like it. So, Jacob was right. I bully people by picking their names. So I'm going to do that to Alyssa. So going into our next question, what are some effective strategies for sustaining youth voter engagement beyond major election cycles and keeping young voters involved in the political process year round?
Thank you. And I promise I will answer that, but I just had a couple of things I wanted to add to the previous question, but I promise I'll answer it. So thank you all, excited to be here. Agree with a lot that was said. But I think one thing about this like current generation that we're talking about of young people are that they're issue-based voters. And so like sometimes it gets uncomfortable. Like I work at Common Cause, we're a good government organization, and it gets uncomfortable because I can't talk to students about redistricting or any of the other Common Cause issues without realizing that like they also care about pro-choice and they care about environmental justice. And so I think until we're able to like connect all these other issues that are happening in the world, like gun violence and so many other things, to the issues that are like our bread and butter and our mission statement, we aren't going to be able to build those true organic relationships. And so sometimes that means that like, yes, I'm gonna show up and go to a pro-choice rally with my students, and I'm gonna show up to an environmental justice rally, and I'm going to be there for them, just like I want my students to show up when we're having our Moore v. Harper events and rallies and all these other things. So I think it's really important that to truly like mobilize students, like we have to connect with what they care about, and we can't just think like, oh, they're going to vote because I told them to vote because this like redistricting is on the ballot, or is the census, or is this, or is that, but we have to really make it relatable to them. And I know Noah, you mentioned all of the like great success we had in 2022, and we know every year after we have a great successful turnout, we then get laws, we get bills, we get hundreds of bills every year after there's great turnout. And this year, like a lot of the bills that we've seen have been to like remove polling sites off of college campuses. And so when I was at the Common Cause North Carolina office, we had a trustee on the board of Winston-Salem State University, which is a historically Black college, say that faculty was bribing students to vote so that that campus did not deserve to have a polling site. And it took us like 5 years of organizing, getting students to go to Board of Elections meetings and really speak up for like why they should have a polling site, to be able to bring back not only an election day site, but an early voting site. And of course, like most HBCUs, that campus is in a Black community that definitely need to have access to a polling site. So those were just a couple things I wanted to raise about like the importance of grassroots and like mobilizing students beyond the election cycle, is to get them in front of lawmakers. We do advocacy days every year, and a lot of times those advocacy days have helped us with getting more funding for HBCUs in our state. We were able to get some financial aid relief to some HBCUs, and then also we were able to get some polling sites restored. But I know the question that I was assigned was around effective strategies. And I think like the main one I would say is, of course, just like that peer-to-peer and finding ways to engage beyond like the major election cycles. If we're not talking to them now, we're not going to be able to mobilize them to vote next year or even this November. And so like if you have local elections, I know Virginia actually has like a lot of their big elections this year. If we're not in conversation right now, then like November is going to be way too late. So it's just finding ways to continuously engage and also to invest in that engagement. Unfortunately, I think some of the panelists, we talked about this earlier, sometimes it takes an Uber Eats gift card to get a student to attend a webinar training. And, you know, like it's unfortunate, but like, you know, you got to meet them where they're at. Usually they're hungry. T-shirts are kind of working still, but they don't always work because there's a lot of free T-shirts on campuses now. But it's just like trying to find these different avenues to keep them engaged and not just think about them when it comes time for them to go vote.
Absolutely agree. I kind of want to open this question up when we're talking about these strategies to the rest of the floor. Are there anything else that people would want to add? Go for it, Jacob.
So Alyssa, I love everything you just said, and it generated a whole bunch of other things. I mean, just to begin with, honing in on the intersectionality piece, I think one of the sort of forever questions, particularly in this country, is like, when we look at the work of people like Frederick Douglass or Ella Baker, or really any of the movements throughout US history that have led to really lasting change, even like the people who I most admire in the world, like eventually so many of those groups, so many of those bonds and those networks of power that were formed ended up falling apart or dissolving or slowly dissipating because of really effective divide and conquer tactics. And so Alyssa, just like +1, because I think that's the question that like no one in this country has ever figured out in a really sustainable way of like how to build intersectional power while embracing difference. And I think especially for young people, especially for Gen Z today, like there's so much attention to identity, there's so much nuance, there's so much willingness to embrace who I am without telling you who you can or cannot be, that I have like genuine deep hope about their ability to figure out those answers. Second thing I'll mention is I think we need to be centering power as a lens to view voting. And within that, we need to be centering the vision that young people want to have. I think so many Gen Z folks today are in survival mode. The average high schooler has more stress, more anxiety than somebody returning from active duty in Vietnam 50 years ago. And I think about what that actually means as an experience, and it's hard to wrap my mind around. And so I think one of the jobs of folks who have been organizing for a while is to invite young people to imagine what world they do want to live in. So for example, in Rhizome, students vote, draft, and then vote on the visions that we want to have. And our vision is grounded in a world where there's conditions that enable every single person to be safe, to be happy, to be healthy. And I think often young folks need someone to put their arm around them and say, okay, we know that like you're in survival mode right now, but if you give yourself permission to dream for a moment, what world do you want to live in? And how can you build power in order to get there, and treat power as the capacity to affect purpose? And then the last thing I would add, just to piggyback on everything Alyssa said, is I think young people, they want to be taking action within a pipeline, within a continuity that they're able to imagine, okay, what does next year look like for me? What does the year after look like for me? What does it look like if I'm going to start being an organizer in high school to then go to college, or to be 22, 18 in that range, and then continue that work? And then what does my life look like as a young adult? And I think especially in a time of like deep economic insecurity, when so many young people aren't going to make as much as previous generations, that's especially important. And so, yeah, Nile, as you talk about like groups like the NAACP, groups like the League of Women's Voters who have those networks, one of the really fascinating ways that I think folks who have been in this space for a long time can add value to the lives of young people is to figure out like, okay, after you graduate from high school, after you're 22, 23, you're entering a job market, how can we make paths to doing this work in a sustainable way more accessible, especially for young people from under-resourced backgrounds, especially for young people who haven't historically held power. So sorry, that was a lot. That was a lot of words and said way too quickly, but Alyssa, you just like got me hyped. And so I wanted to respond to all the things. Noah, it looks like you have a hand up, and also Francesca.
Yeah, I think Francesca, I know you had your hand up first. So would you want to, go for it? I keep saying go for it, but it's such a good phrase for this type of.
I mean, I know that's right. It's such a good phrase. And so everything that was said before is just wonderful. And to be honest with you, Jacob, that's literally what is one of our workshops for this summer that we did on, in terms of imagining what it could be as a Black youth in this America, in this environment, what you would imagine when facing gun violence, when facing education, being your representation in the books are currently being erased. And so to the question that's at hand, I truly believe in consistency in sustaining youth voter engagement. Fortunately and unfortunately, this generation, my generation, is fueled by fast growing technology where information is conveyed and shared in multiple social avenues in a matter of minutes, where we're looking at so many things that we get overwhelmed by those things. And so how do we capture those, capture ourselves in reaching the retention span, as well as capturing their interest? And so with what I truly believe in, if you have a steady following, whether on Instagram, whether on Facebook, whether on just your text messages on your phone, you share various information with your family, with your friends, with your coworkers, with members of your association/chapters about these updates on policy issues and fun facts about voter education or voter registration, or some of these laws are preventing voter preventing people to have voting rights. And so with the National Youth and College Division, we title these efforts as part of our Center for Innovation. And we focus on these issues that are important to you. We kind of give each issue their own separate entity, because we know that just having that one person that focused on that, for instance, health and well-being, we have so many people that want to do health and well-being in terms of pro-choice and a reproductive right. We also know that we have youth that want to deal with gun violence and dealing with the gun laws that impact our communities. And so we also lead in terms of vote like our lives depend on it. This civic engagement campaign is utilizing social media as well as getting engaged with the community, whether it's through door canvassing, whether it's through flyers, whether it's through just young adults coming together for a lunch or a gathering to just talk about these issues and or chatting it up on this social media website or phone banking. I mean, for me, I just know as a youth that's been in this fight since I was 1 year old, and seeing all the other young leaders before me and seeing that intersectionality is important for our youth that are coming up and seeing us so that they can be able to be like, you know what, I love that idea. I'm going to use that wheel, but maybe I'll add my spin on it. And so, you know, those things I appreciate, but we also must have consistency. If we can't have consistency where maybe a date where we can send calendars to our youth of what's going on or what's happening, and we just, you know, and if we don't follow it and we're just doing it by the spur of that moment, it's going to lose their attention, or it's going to exhaust them. So the consistency is my key.
Literally, consistency is everything. I think even in building relationships with young people, kind of building off what Alyssa said, is if I only hear about you around the electoral cycle, whether it's a specific action or a specific initiative that you want me to vote in the direction of, and in no times and in other situations, I'm not providing resource, I'm not providing engagement, I'm not providing attention, then it's very clear that what you're trying to build is a transactional relationship. And I don't think that transactions translate to meaningful, intentioned, and sustainable relationships with young people, especially because when we care about our issue areas, even though we have, like, maybe it was on the ballot abortion rights for the Constitution now, but in the interim, there's still so much that has to be done around reproductive health. Politically, socially, resource-wise, are we supporting that? Are we creating space for that? But Noah, I know you had your hand up, so I'll let you close out this question.
Yeah, I thought that was a really great segue into what I was going to say now, which is both kind of pegging off of Jacob and Francesca in the sense of it's really easy to burn out as an individual and as an organization, right? We've seen so many wonderful organizations over the years and organizers over the years just burn out. And it's also really hard to sustain these relationships with young people because of their transient nature, because of a lot of factors. So one thing we found at the Worker Circle that is critical is having fun, and not just like having fun with your organizing, like, you know, but like literally doing like fun community events that are completely not transactional, not related to getting them out to vote. Maybe you have a little voter registration table, but that's not the point of the barbecue. So at the Worker Circle, we have all kinds of, you know, joyful programs with our college network. We have a radical reading group. We have picnics in the park. We had an online concert of like Yiddish revolutionary songs. And I think it's really important to get young people out and also to show them you really care about them. And yeah, I see, as Ramel put in the chat, joy is radical work. It reminds us what we're fighting for, that we are all human, and that we have a better world to build together. So I think having fun is a really critical and often missed part of engaging young people.
Yeah, say it again, joy is radical work. Especially because I think as things get bleaker and bleaker, we have to create those spots of hope and commitment, because, you know, and also just allowing young people to feel stifled in moments where things aren't going our way politically, because some of it is severe. When the affirmative action case came out, yes, there was work to be done. We still had to maintain our momentum, but a big part of creating space and relationship with young people was saying it sucks. Obviously, your race is not everything with your application, but if you know you got into this school and you were able to build this, that, and the other, and you have siblings coming into the pipeline, and you know that fundamentally their identities, their intersections of identities, their communities are not going to be able to be weighed in a meaningful, or at least similar way that allows you to be where you are, that hurts. And you have to rest in that. So also allowing people to kind of take heed of that and then transition into what are the action items as a result. I think that's also incredibly important. And kind of going into our last, structured question before we're going into our nice little Q&A, and I'm going to go for Ruby with this one because I know like we want an equal distribution of answers. How can intergenerational collaboration and mentorship play a role in supporting and inspiring young voters?
Yeah, I've just been sitting back and listening to everyone because I think that this is a lot more impactful than a lot of the research that I can offer you, hearing from these folks who are dealing with it firsthand. But I think that this point of intergenerational collaboration is really a inspiring and untapped area of potential when you're thinking about youth civic engagement. I think that intergenerational collaboration can be so powerful, and a huge part of that is because it allows everyone to sort of bring what they offer and what they're best at to the table and have that be valued equally. I think that's really huge when you're thinking about this. So young people may show up with energy, passion, creativity, or a sense of urgency. Adults may have technical and policy know-how, connections, time, and resources that young people don't have. And when you bring those things together, it can start to counteract some of the other challenges we've been talking about. Like, we talk a lot about how it's really hard for young organizers to have to dedicate all this time on top of work and school and all the other demands of their lives. But if adults are able to shoulder some of that time burden and step up to the plate with those things, I think that can help. And that's one of the benefits of this intergenerational collaboration, is that it allows everyone to lean on each other and play into their assets and their strengths. I think that bringing more people together like that can help to cause not only more effective voter engagement, where, for instance, if you're a league, you go find some young people who can help you with your efforts. I think there's a lot of people asking about like how to get in contact with this group of people in the chat right now. And I think one of the best ways is talk to young people, talk to them about the issues they care about, and have them bring them into your work and allow them to inform what your efforts are when it comes to engaging young people. I think that having supportive intergenerational connections can help to model civic participation to young people and help to boost their confidence around elections. I think we see often, and our data shows it, that a lot of young people don't feel qualified to participate in our democracy. After 2022, we found that over half of young people feel like they're not qualified to participate in politics, which is crazy because everyone is qualified to participate in politics. Like, you don't have to know everything. You don't have to understand every political issue. And I think that having adults who can model that is really important and normalize that it's okay to not know everything about a candidate or an election or a policy. And so I think that's one of the benefits of that kind of intergenerational connection. I think the last point I'll say is that you have to be careful and thoughtful when you're creating these kinds of intergenerational collaborations, because if you do it wrong, it can have the opposite impact. There's a lot of young people who may not have great relationships with adults in their lives because adults haven't come to them from a place of thoughtfulness, and they don't treat them as equals. They don't treat them like what they have to say matters. And I think that it's essential to approach any kind of effort like this with open-mindedness and with a lot of intention around how you're engaging young people. Circle recently put out a guide for how some sort of best practices and principles for how to have these youth adult partnerships. And I think that's really a good place to look because, and I can put it in the chat, I already did once, but it outlines the importance of sort of valuing what everyone has to offer and thinking of young people as experts in their own lives and not just thinking of them as like a number, as we've been talking about. So trying to really get rid of that sort of transactional approach and approaching these things with, a lot of more intention and open-mindedness. So I'll put that in the chat. But I think that there is so much potential, especially for the League of Women Voters, to really beef up these intergenerational collaborations. But there's also a lot of risk that comes along with that if you don't do it right. So hopefully this can be a path towards greater engagement and greater intergenerational collaboration in our democracy, because I think there's a lot of untapped potential there.
Thank you, Ruby. And, we got maybe a few more minutes before I would hope to go to Q&A. So is there anything that people want to build on when we're talking about the intergenerational network for the work that we're all doing? See, Ruby, you were worried about sharing, but here you are. You don't even got nothing to add. We're like, that was great. And it was wonderful. Okay, well then, again, thank you to all of our panelists for being a part of this conversation. I definitely feel a lot of energy and I'm already excited. I want to vote and I don't have an election coming up. So it's like, oh my goodness. But yeah, I think I will transition into some of the questions that we saw. I think a lot of them are equally helpful, engaging what we can be putting out and what would be helpful for people to hear. So as I'm still kind of collecting and reading some of the ones we already had prior, if there are new ones that you still want to kind of get in there, let us know, especially because all of our organizations are really interested in building resource and speaking directly to people's needs. So even if it's not a question that's answered into this space, that's something we're pulling back into our organizations and saying there should be a resource or something that addresses this, because we saw that a lot when we were having the panel discussion. So one that I saw that I really liked and that I'll probably try to speak to directly is, where is it? What would you say to people who believe that youth can volunteer but should not have decision-making roles? And how do we combat narratives that lead to that way of thinking, right? So a big thing that I talk about in a lot of my work is adultism. And adultism is the idea that there is an age limit, there is a structured process wherein you are someone who can be making reasonable decisions. And one thing that I would always say to that is that there is really no other population of people, without it being incredibly paternalistic and building on like centuries of marginalization, where you're saying there's a certain level of pedigree or process you have to go to be able to speak to the needs of your own population. There has to be some level of trust that young people understand themselves, understand their socio-political positioning, and understand how to bring other young people into that space. And it's also that if you want people to be engaged, you build out leadership before it's time to lead. It's not like, when I pay my first mortgage, that's when I'll know how to do politics, right? Obviously, those experiences, and as we grow, we're interacting with different settings, that's going to be relevant. And that is going to change the way that I'm showing up. If I ever have children, that's going to change the way that I'm showing up. But even with young people, I saw a question in the chat that was like, what is our age range? 18 to 29, right? So I made the joke about mortgage, but there's probably already somebody within the young people space of 18 to 29 who has the kids, who is paying the mortgage, and who's having that political and social experience, right? So I definitely just think that in order to have the young people who are then supposed to be the leaders that we would want, we have to be creating spaces where we trust their voices and their leadership now. But I'll open the floor to someone else speaking to that question.
Love you, Nile.
Francesca, I see your hand up.
And just to piggyback off of you now, I mean, overall, I mean, for what is leadership if it's not to be passed down? Leadership must be passed down. Each generation has the opportunity to come up and lead for their own specific time, and then pass it over to the next generation for them to lead those fights. And so I see, again, that intergenerational role is so important, as we do need wisdom from our elders. We do need wisdom from previous leaders that have the knowledge, that have the resources to come and help us be like, hey, you don't have to create the new wheel. Just here's the wheel that has worked. You could just critique it to your own. And so, when I'm brought with that question, as in like, hey, you can volunteer, but you can't decide on whether or not how you volunteer. I'm like, I don't know then. I mean, is that, I mean, I should have some say, since these laws are going to impact me later on in the future. Right. And so, So from all that, I don't want to take away from you, Miles. You said it best. And so I'm gonna let everybody else go in and say.
Yeah. So I would say for Rhizome, we spent literally our first year building a shared decision-making system that's authentically student-led. So initially we voted on everything and it was terrible and we didn't get anything done. But slowly over time, we've refined it and asked students, okay, what are the really big picture decisions you want to vote on? So they vote on our goals, they vote on our vision, they vote on any overall changes to our work environment, they vote on any nominees to our board of directors, and they vote to decide unified national actions that we take. So for example, next year, we're going to collectively write a student bill of rights that's focused on mental health and culturally competent curriculum. And that is the outcome of a 6-month process. So one, I would say, like, you can do it, but you have to work hard. You have to be willing to put in the time. To Nile's point, like, it's not like all of a sudden students just are going to take it and run with it. Like, you have to build genuine relationships. The second thing I would say to somebody who poses that question is, like, you shouldn't be organizing with young people if you're not willing to give them power. Like, you just shouldn't. You should be organizing, great, wonderful, but not with young people. Because if there's an unwillingness to build power and share it, then they have no skin in the game. They're not going to be able to see themselves in it. And fundamentally, you're going to be replicating the same power dynamics that have been going on in our country for a long time. And the third thing I would say is, like, some things are easier done than said. And I think that, like, we're going to see people like Noah, we're going to see Gen Z, like people like Francesca, just doing the work in the coming decade. And I think that's a question that, like, 10 years from now will answer itself. And I think one of the roles of people like us who are on this call is to accelerate that process and to engage in what Francesca was talking about, of handing the baton and then also working really hard to provide that structured support.
Wonderful.
One thing,
Go for it.
I was just going to add one thing that Jacob made me think of is, I think we also have to know, like, once we stop taking up space and let young people have a seat at the table, that table is going to change. Like, you can't have meetings at 1 o'clock in the afternoon anymore. Like, I know I do my fellows check-ins at 8 o'clock at night, sometimes Central Time, and I live in Eastern Time zone, but like, we won't be able to do those traditional things. And so I know, like, sometimes that change is scary, but like, if we really want them to be able to really have a say, we have to meet them where they're at. And like, usually that is going to be 8 p.m. Zoom calls after like class and lab is finished. So I think that's like another important thing just to be mindful of. And recently, Common Cause, we started working on lowering the voting age to 16. And like, every place that has had success with lowering their voting age has all been done by high schoolers. And so like, I have a policy where I would not submit testimony or anything for lowering the voting age. I will ghostwrite, I would support, but like, it's not for me to be the spokesperson for that. Because we've seen all the wins come from like younger people. We could provide resources, we could provide tools when it comes to like turning people out to vote on that, but we can't be the face of that movement because that movement is not for us.
No, absolutely agree. And I think this next question kind of builds into that. I guess it speaks to us more personally, but I think it could be helpful more broadly. So, because there's been a lot of conversation in the chat around, okay, how do we bring young people into this space and how do we engage them and keep them there? And one of the questions asked us to speak to how we became engaged in this civic and like social advocacy space, and how do we become leaders? So maybe that's something that could be helpful in terms of takeaways. So who would like to overshare about their political journey and maybe how that could be helpful to some of the audience? I can say that I was weird. Where I was as a child was geographically interesting, right? So I spent the first 5 years of my life in Iowa, and I have very distinct memories of my mom and my grandmother leading caucuses and being in those socio-political spaces, right? So I think one thing that was really important for me was not just showing politics as a specific event. Like, yes, there were those caucuses, but in between those major moments, it was conversation, it was dialogue, it was what they were going to engage with, not just in the elections, but are there school board meetings? Are there other spaces where you're kind of putting forward a civic or social engagement. So making it very clear that politics was not atypical. It wasn't an every 2 years thing. It was an everyday thing, was incredibly important. And I think kind of something that other people spoke to in terms of my personal experiences, it has very much been my voice mattering, which is a motivation to speak in the first place. I think in a lot of the political spaces that I've been in, there's been a question like, okay, if we're talking about young people, where do you think we should be going with that? Well, if you were a young person and we were talking about email subject lines, what is more interesting to you? And what I think is those questions and that basis of interaction allows me to know that I matter, what I say matters, and what I say is going to directly relate to what is done and what decisions are made. And so I think having that as a consistent experience for me in my political spaces from a young person to a young adult now, it made it so that we can come into league spaces and other partner spaces and not just come with the hope and not just the assumption, but the determination to matter. That if I'm going to be here, it has to be to make some level of decision and I wield some level of power. But that's just kind of like my personal narrative. I'd love to hear what some of the other panelists have to say to that question.
Alyssa, I loved what you were saying about Common Cause's work lowering the voting age to 16, because that's when I got my start organizing. I was 16 and it was 2016. Trump had just been elected, and I organized with some friends a walkout from my high school. Like 250 kids walked out from my high school. There's a great photo of me. Like I had borrowed a drum from the marching band. I was in the drum line and we were marching in the protest. So it was really powerful protest, and we were marching against some of his bigoted language and, you know, kind of the expectation of policy. And so the idea to me that young people aren't political actors doesn't make any sense to me, because at 16, I knew what I believed, and I was willing to take a stand for it. And I think many 16-year-olds feel that way if they're given the tools and the ability to do so, and the access to do so. So I just really appreciate what you brought up, that's something Common Cause is working on.
Happy to jump to another question if nobody else has anything to share on this point. Okay, we're going for it. Okay, a question that came up a lot, which I think would be helpful, is how do we engage voters, not just in that national sense, but in that local and state level?
So this actually relates to how I would have answered the last question if I had spoken up, which is that when I was 16 or 17, there was a school bond measure in Portland, where I'm from, that had to do with my high school. And it was to rebuild my school. It passed eventually, but the building just got completed. So I never benefited from it. But I remember that there was a few students in my class who got really engaged in the process, and they were bringing their friends to every school board meeting, and they were advocating for making sure that it got passed and that the funding was distributed in an equitable way. And eventually we walked out of school together, and I learned so much in that process about the school board and the power of the school board and how it connects to the city council. And that is like some of the most boring minutia that can exist. Like, for a young person, that is just not very interesting, but it does have really direct impacts on young people's lives. And so I think that finding a way, the only reason I ever learned about all of that is because there was this thing that was happening to my school. And it was an issue that we all cared about because we knew that we'd had the ceiling tiles fall on our head. Like, we knew that there was one stall in the whole school that worked in the bathrooms. Like, we had that direct experience. So I think that when you're thinking about how to get young people engaged at the local level, it's about informing them and helping them to see the connections between the issues they care about and local politics. I think it's really hard as a young person to learn about local government and to learn about local issues. Like, think about where you learn about local issues. Like, do you have to pay for that local news source? Is it from like a Facebook group? Do you think young people are in that Facebook group? I think young people have no idea. Well, this isn't true. The research actually doesn't say this, so I'm not going to say it. But I think that it's just really hard. I consistently hear from young people, like my friends, that it's hard to know where to find out information about local elections and local government and local democratic processes. So I think that it's so important that adults who have a bit more of that knowledge, because I think there was a time when there was better local news and it was easier to learn about sort of the local center of power. I think that that's wisdom that older people can really share with young people. And I think that so many young people care about so many issues, but they may not see how, there's local county elections actually connect to environmental issues or to racial justice issues or to economic issues. So I think that helping to connect that for young people more is really important. And I think that talking to them about the issues that they care about and then informing them about how they play out at the local and state level is a great way to sort of start to do some of that work.
I would also kind of add, especially because you were talking about that local connection, and I think it builds into one of the other questions that we saw, which was how do we get young people engaged in specific elections? And one thing is, it's actually from data that Circle also provided, is that it's interesting to look at what are the issues that bring the young people who do vote to the ballot, and for the young people who don't vote, what do they still care about? So for young people who are interested in and actually get to the ballot box, it's abortion, it's climate change, it's gun control and gun violence. But when we're looking to young people who aren't showing up but are still politically involved and concerned, it's racism, it's access to a living wage, and it's access to secure housing. So when we look at those different divergences at that local level, especially when something is a bit more abstract like racism, it's hard to know whether or not me voting for this specific governor is going to change racism. But when we bring it down to that local level and we're talking about, say, a school board election, the school board can't fix everything. But if I care about racism, I know the school board decides whether or not we're banning AP African American history, or if we're banning conversations around gender and race in the classroom, or whether or not we're denying nonpartisan groups like LWV and Rhizome access to those classrooms to provide neutral but efficient and sustainable civic education. And so, especially for those young people whose concerns are a bit more amalgamous and aren't directly pinpointed to a point A to point B voting structure, looking to the local lens allows them to see their impact more clearly. And that's more of a motivating call than I think a lot of what we have going on at the national level. Going into one of the other questions, we have like 2 minutes left, so this will probably be our closing one, but I think it's a really important one because it talks about access and I think maybe decolonizing where we see value and what young people we uplift is how are we going to reach young people, ages 18 to 29 who aren't in colleges, who aren't in those higher education spaces. So I'd love for someone to speak to that.
I can jump in. So my answer to this question is the same as my answer to the last question, which is the same as my answer to the last question, which is convenient. About 33% of people never go to college in this country. The vast majority do go to high school. When we think about like youth voter registration in particular, and we think about it starting in college, like we wonder why there's gaps in access. High schools are an untapped, sustainable source of civic power for young people to create the world that they want to live in. And so my answer to this question and the previous question and the previous question is to uplift the comment that Cheryl left in the chat about having formal ownership within the League of Women's Voters be shared among young people as well. If you want to localize the work, if you want to connect with folks and empower folks who aren't going to college, if you want to do the work in a way that's sustainable for young people, invite them into your local leagues and create formal structures where they know you don't have to tell them. It's not a story, it's not a narrative. They know they have power because they see it. If I was in all of your shoes, I would do what Cheryl did, and then I would see what happens, because it might work, it might not work, it will work, but it might not. Either way, it'll be fun and it'll be interesting. And if it goes well, all of a sudden the League of Women's Voters, the league in your area, it's going to look very, very different. It's going to be a lot more interesting for all of you to shepherd and to guide and to structure. So that would be my answer.
Thank you, Jacob. And I see we're right at 6. So what I want to do real quick is whether to that question or just generally for our panelists, are there any important takeaways, quotes, something that you really want people to leave the space in hearing from you?
I guess I could start. One thing I would say is I think a lot of times when it comes to young people, we think everything has to be digital, but there is still definitely a huge digital divide because of our rural communities and like communities that just don't have access to broadband. So don't forget those old school organizing tactics because they still work and still have power.
I'll say that I loved seeing everyone putting in the chat and our panelists who talked about sort of how they got started in this work. And I think it's incredible to see the diversity of pathways that people use to get launched into this kind of civic participation. And I think that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about your programming and how you start to bring young people into the fold and do exactly what Jacob was just talking about, is that it can't be one size fits all. Every young person is going to have a different topic that appeals to them, a different communication style that's going to be effective, a different institutional approach, whether it's through school or a table at a grocery store or through their labor union, whatever it may be. So I think that really thinking about how you can create an ecosystem with other organizations in your community to try to create as many pathways as you can to reach as great of a diversity as you can is really going to be the best way that you all can continue to grow young voters and start to sorry, Jacob's laughing because growing voters is like Circle's tagline, and I was going to try not to bring it up, but it's just natural. Anyways, check out the Growing Voters report if you want to learn more. We have a whole report on this, but yeah, really just thinking about how you can create those many pathways for a greater diversity of young people.
I also would like to thank everyone for showing up and coming out and being on this call and being able to hear from us, as well as I'm also thankful for hearing you all on the panel, for hearing you all's interests, as well as what you guys do in this work and how we can, again, be able to connect with one another to continue on this work. And to and just like Fannie Lou Hammer said, if you are in the Lord, as I am, you could pray until you faint, but if you don't get up and try to do something, God is not going to put it in your lap. So I just thank you all, and I appreciate you for giving me this opportunity to listen and to share.
Thank you. We love a good quote. Noah?
Yeah, I also want to say thank you to you, Nile, and to the League of Women Voters for having me on this panel. And thank you to all the other panelists for your wisdom and sharing your knowledge with us. And the one thing I think I want to stress is really the importance of intergenerational organizing. I think when we take action together as members of different generations side by side, there's this kind of fundamental equality that happens where the 19-year-old is as important as the 49-year-old, who's as important as the 89-year-old. And then it kind of becomes this thing where instead of older people or people finger wagging and saying, why aren't you doing more? Why aren't you voting? When we take action together, it becomes this thing of what beautiful thing can we build together? And I think that's really important.
No, these are wonderful. Oh my goodness. Y'all took what I would say. I don't know. I guess my big takeaway is that I'm obviously very energetic and engaged, but that does not always correlate to how hopeful I feel. So I guess the biggest thing that I always talk about is the momentum regardless, because there are some days where I want to move, but then it's like, there's not really better places to move politically right now. So, and that's also, I guess, another thing is that, knowing that it's up to us to make our situation better, and that there's no place to move or hide away from these social political issues that we have to face. And in doing so, we make it a better place. So yeah, I guess that's everyone's takeaways. Thank you so much for joining us. Obviously Rhizome, Worker Circle, they all do phenomenal work in this youth space, and LWVUS is continuing to try to build that and to make sure we have initiatives that allow us to do the same. But, these dialogues and conversations are an important first step in kind of doing that successfully. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. There will be a follow-up email where we're sharing the recording of this call and other important details and resources that were shared throughout the call in the chat. But yeah, that closes us out. So thanks again.